The Chicken Asylum, an Alex Reynolds mystery. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's, Griffin, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 18. The signs had been tacked to the cannery, but a long time ago, and the red brushwork of their warnings had almost faded out. Danger, condemned, unsafe, keep out. He climbed the warped steps to the truck loading dock, shoreside, away from the brunt of the weather. It still felt sturdy underfoot, but its barn-like sliding door didn't budge. When he heaved at it, the overhead rollers looked rusted to their tracks. He chose the deck to the left, the one where gaps in the planks had been repaired with bright new boards. It led all the way out to the end of the long, sad building. The railing wasn't in shape. In places it had fallen away. He leaned gingerly on it to look at the dark water below, curling and foaming around weed-hung barnacled pilings. He found a door, boarded up. He went on for another 20 yards, and there was a second door, like the first. He tugged at one of the boards. The nail heads popped, and the board came away in his hands. He swung and tossed it over the railing into the tide. The nails in the second board came away as easily. He drew back, careful where he stood, and gave the door a kick. It fell in with a rip of hinge screws and rotten wood. Dust billowed up. The door tilted and slid through a yawn in the floor and splashed below. Gripping the doorframe, he leaned inside. The place looked vastly empty, but the light was poor. Decades of salt spray had blinded the high windows. The only real light struck down through cankered holes in the roof, past big white wooden crossbeams held by bolts that had been bleeding rust for a long time. Among the wooden beams and the beams of light, swallows flickered in and out of lumpy mud nests. The twittering of the birds echoed shrill in the emptiness. Dave edged a foot around the doorframe and tried a floorboard. It felt secure, keeping a grip on the doorframe. He put his weight on the board. It held, and he let go of the doorframe, and was standing inside the building in the gloom. The piercing cries of the swallows above, the hiss and wash of the sea below. He wished for the flashlight that was in the Electra, sunk in its flat tires under the Bayfront Motel. He groped his way through the dark, testing each board as he went and holding to wall studs. Something hulked up between him and the frail light. Not all of the machinery was gone. Here were banks of pipes, plate still, gears, cogwheels, broken and drooping, conveyor belts. The pale faces of gauges peered at him. He seemed to smell the reek of cooking fish. Again, he went a good many steps before the machinery was not beside him anymore. And it was very dark. The sea had muscle out here, and the old structure shook. He began not to trust the flooring. Maybe he had guessed wrong. Maybe he ought to give this up. And then he thought the structure was shaking because something was hitting it. Something solid. Clunk. It went in the darkness. Clunk, clunk. Measured, hollow, heavy. And each time the floor shivered. He smiled grimly to himself. He saw Tyree Smith again, drunk, unsteady on his legs, under the jacaranda tree. "Where do you keep that boat of yours?" Voices sea-washed, wind tattered, talking about fog and tides and hauls of fish through the shiny radio on the shelf in back of Ben Orton's desk. Day pushed away from the half-safety of the cannery wall. It was down there in the dark, not far now, not far. He let the muffled thudding guide him in a tall slit of light, so narrow it kept flickering out, where doors meet. He took maybe 20 steps on flooring without flaw. Then he stepped out on nothing. The surprise made him cry out. The sound went up to the metal roof and ricocheted off it, and for an instant the swallows were silent. Falls in the dark were all alike. You couldn't judge how long they took. He expected water. It wasn't water. He hit an ungiving horizontal surface. On his feet, but off balance. Then he struck his head. Something prodded him roughly in the gut. He groaned and rolled away from it. It prodded him in the left kidney. He wanted to escape it, and he tried to crawl. Pain burst inside his skull. He lay still. The pain slowly dulled. He touched his head, and his hand came away wet and sticky. The prod was to his ribs, this time, and less prod than kick. He rolled over again, careful of his head, but not able to be careful enough. The pain made him yelp. He waited for it to back off, then opened his eyes. Light slammed into them, the fierce, dying light of the sky. He shut his eyes, but his other senses worked. The planks he lay on vibrated. There was the beat of an engine beneath them, the quiver of a propeller shaft. He heard water slicing off a bow, the tumble of water at a far stern. The deck lifted under him and dropped. Vomit rose in his throat, not from the motion. He didn't get seasick. It had to be from concussion. He couldn't focus right, but the hand he showed himself was thick with blood from his head. He panted quickly, shallowly against the nausea. He was gripped roughly under the arms. Al Franklin's face, bearded, sunburned, was upside down above him. He hauled Dave to his feet. "Come on, you prying son of a bitch. Off my boat and out of my goddamn life." He swung Dave around in a bear hug. A red horizon, the white superstructure of the boat, a dazzle of glass wheeled sickly. Dave sagged. Franklin staggered. "Help yourself, for Christ's sake. This wreck won't steer itself. I haven't got time to fuck around with you." The boat pitched. Spray flew up. They did a drunken waltz. The boat yawed. They came hard and together against a wooden gunwale. Franklin gripped him around the middle and tried to lift him, very far off. Dave glimpsed shoreline, tiny La Calita, with sundown sparkling off its windows. The boat plowed into a wave and shuddered. White water foamed around their legs. The scuppers sucked. Franklin staggered off balance again. Dave gripped the rail, raised himself. The pain ripping around inside his skull, and brought a foot down hard on Franklin's instep. It was protected only by a sandal. Franklin let him go, so suddenly Dave dropped to his knees. He skidded on his knees across the wet deck and slammed up against the edge of an open hatch. Below were broken crates and bundles of packing straw. Franklin fell on Dave's back, wrenching at him. Dave sank teeth into his fingers. Franklin clubbed him with a fist above the ear. Dave blacked out. He woke face down in his own vomit. He turned. Franklin stood over him, long hair flying. The ship tilted and he sat down hard on the deck. Something was under Dave's hand, a shaft of cold, wet metal. Franklin lurched to his feet and flung himself at Dave. Dave swung the crowbar at Franklin's head. It connected. Franklin rolled with the ship and came to rest, crumpled against the gunwale. Dave dragged himself toward the wheelhouse. "The fountain didn't soak all the blood and hair off," Jerry Orton said. "I could see it, and his greasy prints. I didn't need the lab, or you. I need an arrest." All of a sudden, Dave said wryly, he lay in a long new room where high beds were shut off from each other by white canvas sheets, laced inside pipe frames on wheels. He had the best bed, the one next to the window, since the ward was empty. The private rooms of La Calita's little one-story hospital were filled. One of them with Al Franklin. Through the window, Dave could see the blue bay, the ragged black rocks, the floating brown kelp. A pair of otters played among the kelp. While he'd pushed a bland breakfast around with his fork, he'd watched an otter lie on its back in the water, clutch a leg-waving crab against his chest, rip it apart, and stuff the meat into its mouth. It looked as if it were chortling. "And so, you went to the gallery and asked for him in a loud voice and let Mona Windrow keep you talking while he beat it out the back door and down to his boat." Dave coughed a short, hurtful laugh. "Maybe you didn't need me. I sure as hell needed you." "Never. Jerry Orton shook his head. You handled the bastard. He sounded disgusted at himself. You handled it all just fine. Not in the right order, Dave said. I got in your way, Orton said. I apologize. Dave shrugged and winced. His muscles ached. You were trying to protect your father, family. So tell me, what does Franklin say? What did he kill your father? Self-defense. My father was going to turn him in. When Franklin walked through the patio doors, carrying one of those things to show him the trip had been, well, a success. My father was waiting for him with a gun. Oh, what kind of success? Dave wondered. Hell, he'd got what he went for. My father financed the trip. It was Mona Windrow's idea. Franklin's her brother. He knows Mexico, Yucatan, Guatemala. She told us this morning all about those old idols, or whatever you call them. An archaeologist? Dave said. He worked for them. Museums, universities, managed the expeditions, the practical side. Supplies, ships, jeeps, trucks, all that. He must have known the right places to dig. He brought back a whole shipload, didn't he? So why did your father meet with him? A gun? Because he'd found out it was illegal. Those things are national treasures, even the ones still buried in the jungle. The Mexican government practically kills you for taking them out of the country, and the U.S. cooperates. It's kind of ironic. Something my father read in that book on Mexican art Mona Windrow gave him, tipped him off. And he wrote to the experts at the L.A. County Museum. I found the letter they sent him in his den last night, and that's how I know for sure. His eyes were blue, clear and innocent. He stood like a staunch Cub Scout. But I told you before, my father would never get mixed up in anything illegal. Yeah, you told me. Dave nodded and shut his eyes. He was getting double vision again, and the pain in his head was coming back. I didn't believe you then. He framed Lester Green on a marijuana charge. He burned down Eddie Suchik's paper when it was going to print. The reason why... He had a pretty specialized view of what was legal and not. Dave opened his eyes. I still don't believe you. What does Franklin say? Was that the explanation your father gave him? Al Franklin says it's what happened, not what anybody said or why. Orton's face was red. Why would you believe him and not me? A smuggler, a murderer. Because you accepted everything your father ever told you, Dave said. You never questioned him in your life. You're a true believer. They make bad witnesses. You don't understand, Orton said. There are times the law is too slow. It's not flexible. There are wrong things that get done that aren't in the statute books. You have to deal with them. When you're a law enforcement officer, you can't let them go on. Like your sisters marrying Lester Green? That was a personal thing, a private family matter, Orton said. This was a government thing. My father was a loyal American. Explain one thing to me. Dave heard the fragile jingling of a trolley and looked toward the open door. At the end of the long aisle between the sterile, empty beds. If your father didn't know what he was putting his money into was illegal, why did he fix up the cannery as a place to dock and unload the boat in secret? Orton flushed. So my mother wouldn't know about him and Mona Windrow. If they unloaded at the bayfront and carted the stuff to the gallery in broad daylight right in front of God and everybody, people would ask questions. They'd make the connection. They'd gossip, and she'd hear about it. And she was jealous. It was only a business arrangement, but she wouldn't see it that way. I don't know why. She didn't have any reason. He wasn't that kind of man. They had a perfect marriage. The pain in Dave's head got worse. He had to close one eye to see Orton right. The nausea was coming back. He said, Ask your wife what kind of man he was. No. Orton shook his head desperately. Not Dad. Tyree Smith had a nice, safe life up there in his little back room at Mona Windrow's gallery in Monterey, Dave said. And then your father and Franklin broke it up. What's Tyree Smith got to do with this? He had some letters. Dave looked prayerfully toward the door again. From Al Franklin to Mona Windrow. They lied to your father. They weren't brother and sister. They were lovers. We burned all that junk from his trailer, Orton said. Made a bonfire right there on the point. They weren't in his trailer, and Dave said. You know where they were? That letter from the museum wasn't all you found in your father's files last night. Orton looked sick. How'd you find out? I didn't. But I need an explanation that adds up. Your father wouldn't blow a smuggling operation that was about to pay off in $10,000 bills just for the sake of the grand old flag. Even you can't believe that now. He wasn't that kind of man. Jerry, but he was the kind of man that would try to kill Al Franklin once he'd seen those letters, and he did. Why can't you leave anything alone? Orton shouted. Why can't you believe in anything? Don't cry, Dave said. Tell me how Franklin did it. A tall, flat-chested nurse wheeled in the trolley. Dave said, Your father wasn't young, but he looked in pretty good shape. And he had a gun. How did Franklin kill him? He charged, Orton said sulkily. My father pulled the trigger. He missed, but Franklin fell down as if he'd been hit. My father went and bent over him, and Franklin grabbed a broken chunk of the figure and hit him with it. The nurses showed horsey teeth in a clockwork smile. I'm sorry, but it's time for this patient to rest now. Orton picked up his badge-mounted cap. Anything I can do? He mumbled and walked off. Give me a new set of tires, Dave said. The nurse folded back the sheet. A hypodermic glinted in the sea light. Can you turn on your side, please? She said. Something soft and light landed on the bed. He opened his eyes. A black face blurred above him. He tried to smile. He reached out. His mouth was dry and numb from the painkillers they'd shot him up with, but he made it shapewards. I wondered if you'd ever get here. You never did, the blurred face said. Dave squeezed his eyes shut and opened them again. The blurred face said, and he never will. I brought you back the gift you gave him, and I want you to understand me. You keep away from him from now on. Is that clear? Are you conscious? Dave got the man into focus. He wore a neat, new pale suit, silver-framed goggles, and moderate afro. Dave said, I'm as conscious as they let me get in this place. This is the fourth college I put him in to get him away from it, and it worked till you showed up. But you aren't staying. That's what he says. You belong in L.A., and that is fine. You go back to L.A. and let Cecil alone. He's 21, Dave said. Not for 18 months. And I told our mother when she died that I would look after him. And with the Lord's help, I'm going to keep my promise. And you are no part of it. If you come near him again, I'll see that you go to jail. His brother's keeper, Dave said. You got it, the neat man said. And it is not easy. It won't get any easier, Dave said. It will if you go away, the neat man said. I will if you will, Dave said and turned to the window. When he woke again, it was the flat-chested nurse who stood beside the bed. She blinked at the yellow hat. Dave hadn't touched it. It lay where the neat man had dropped it. She picked it up and turned it in her hands. Brows raised, she looked from the hat to Dave, and back at the hat again. Dave said, I thought I'd wear it out of here to hide the bandages. She shook her head and hung it on the lamp. It isn't you, she said. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time. being true to their values.